Madam President, I strongly oppose both the amendment offered by Senators Feinstein and Coburn and the one that is offered by Senator McCain that we'll be voting on here in a couple of hours. My message today is very simple. This assault on America's ethanol industry is both misguided and undeserved. This is truly a homegrown industry built on the investment and labor of many thousands of Americans, providing a product that helps us with one of our most pressing national issues, our dependency on imported oil. Yet here we are debating amendments that I think clearly tell the industry you aren't important, you don't matter, and you don't have the support of the American people. Well, I think that is the wrong, misguided message to be sending. And I'll tell you why. We've been struggling with our dependency on oil for almost 40 years. One of our strategies over that period of time has been to develop and commercialize biofuels. I'm proud to have been in the beginning and continue to be a strong advocate for renewable biofuels produced from domestic feedstocks. We started working on this, as I said, over 30 years ago. It's been a long campaign, but it's been a remarkably successful campaign when you think about it. It took about 20 years for ethanol to get to the point of contributing just a few percent of our gasoline supply. In the past 10 years, biofuels, and particularly ethanol, have gotten to the point they now displace about 10% of our fuel supply. Think about that. 10% of our liquid fuel supply, used basically for transportation, is displaced by biofuels. I think that's a remarkable achievement. No other alternative supply comes close. In fact, no alternative supply provides even 1% of our domestic fuel. Let me repeat that. No other alternative to ethanol comes even close to displacing 1% of imported oil. And yet, ethanol is displacing 10% today. Again, a remarkable achievement. Now, our oil dependency problem is still with it. We still depend on it from many nations that are unstable or unfriendly to us. It's getting worse. Oil imports are costing us, on average, over the last few years, about $100 per barrel. I know many of my colleagues share my strong concern about oil imports and the need to find alternatives. Well, that's why we passed new CAFE standards in the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. That's why we adopted a mandate for renewable biofuels in that same bill, a mandate. Going back further, that's why we began providing tax incentives for biofuels production already in the 1970s. That's why we promoted alternative fuels in the 1991 Energy Bill. That's why many of us today are promoting hybrid and electric vehicles. And that's why we need to continue to support the production of ethanol and other domestic biofuels. Just as increasing efficiency standards have been a big success in reducing demand, promoting biofuels has been by far our biggest success on the supply side. They've gone from a few percent at the turn of the century to about, as I said, 10% today. Moreover, looking ahead, the most likely supply-side alternative to displace the next 10% of our gasoline demand is biofuels. Again, we recognized this fact in 2007 when we adopted the Renewable Fuel Standard 2 that requires 36 billion gallons of biofuels by 2022. 36 billion gallons of biofuels by 2022. Now again, we should pay attention to the options. Let's promote alternatives such as electric vehicles. I'm all for that. But we should also make sure that since we're going to be using liquid fuels for most of our transportation fleet in the next 10, 20 years and beyond, well, we have to look to biofuels. It's renewable, and clean. So our biofuels challenge isn't production, or it really isn't even economics. Our challenge is adapting our transportation markets, our fuel markets, to be able to utilize the biofuels. Now, again, as I said, most of our biofuels today are in the form of ethanol. It will continue to be our principal biofuel for many years to come. However, today, we can only displace 10% of our gasoline, as I've said, in the form of a 10% blend of ethanol. It's called E10. You go to your gas stations, and my friend from Oklahoma is referring to the ethanol blends. That's what we have today. It's limited, basically, most of it to E10. Now, again, we need to be able to use higher blends, 15%, 20%, as high as 85% of ethanol. In fact, in my state and in our neighboring state to the north, Minnesota, we have many pumps that are what they call E85. 85% of the fuel that comes out of it is ethanol, and only 15% is gasoline. And quite frankly, the flexible fuel cars run just fine on that 85% blend. The problem is we need more blender pumps at our filling stations. We don't have them, but we need them. We have them in a few states, but very few states have blender pumps. Now, we need to pass a bill like S-187, the Biofuels Market Expansion Act, which I introduced in January. Now, again, I remember a few years ago that Senator Lugar and I had a meeting in the Ag Committee room, and we had the oil companies in, the major oil companies in, to ask them why they didn't put more blender pumps in their fuel stations. And their answer was very clear and very logical. They said, well, why would we take up valuable space in our filling stations for a blender pump when there are few and almost no flexible fuel cars out there that could use it? Point well taken. So after that, we called in the automobile companies. I know we had Chrysler, we had Ford, GM, Honda, I believe, was there. And we asked them, why don't you make more flexible fuel cars? And the response from their viewpoint was very logical. Why should we build more flexible fuel cars when there aren't any blender pumps out there? Point well taken. So here you have chicken and egg. Gasoline, the oil companies say, well, we don't want to put in blender pumps, no flex fuel cars. Detroit says we don't want to build flex fuel cars because there are no blender pumps. I would point out that in Brazil, almost every car built by Ford, every car built by GM, every car built by Honda or Toyota built in Brazil, every single one basically is flexible fuel. It could burn anything from 10% ethanol to 20% to 50% to 85%, actually in Brazil to 100% of ethanol. That's the direction we need to go here. Now, with these two amendments today, we find ourselves going in exactly the wrong direction. The Feinstein-Coburn amendment tells the ethanol industry it no longer has the support of Congress. And the McCain amendment then would block one of the most critical things we need to do, and that is the installation of flexible fuel pumps. Again, I have said many times that we can reform our biofuels policy. I'm more than willing to give up the ethanol tax credit. I've said that before here on the floor. We can give up the ethanol tax credit if the ethanol industry has access to the market. But the McCain amendment, you take the two amendments together, one pulls the rug out from underneath the ethanol industry in terms of its tax credits. I'm saying, okay, fine. That's fine. We can do that if we have access. Then the McCain amendment comes along and says, you can't use any of the funds that we put in the agricultural bill, in the last ag bill that had tremendous bipartisan support, I might add. Can't use any of that for blender pumps at fuel stations. So here we have it. We're going to tell the ethanol industry you can't get the tax credits, and guess what? We're going to keep you from getting access to the marketplace. Well, that's what we need is market access for ethanol. I mean, you go to Exxon and Mobil and Shell and all those gas stations, you think they want to put in an ethanol pump? Well, they're okay with 10%. They'll do the 10% now. But they need to have to put in those blender pumps. And the automobile companies need to produce cars that are flexible fuel. They do a few of them now, But every car built ought to be flexible fuel. So that, again, people can choose. As I've said, ethanol can stand on its own 2 feet now if people have the right and the freedom and the ability to use it. But if you're up against monopolistic kinds of filling stations that won't permit a blender pump to be put in there, then ethanol has no marketplace. We also need to build a dedicated pipeline for ethanol. You know, the oil companies, gas companies, they have their own pipelines. They won't put any ethanol through those pipelines. Well, they say it's water and all that, but let's face it, they won't put any ethanol through their pipelines. Well, we can build, and the private sector, not the government, the private sector can build and is willing to build and is ready to build a dedicated pipeline from the Midwest to the East Coast. A couple of companies have already secured most of the right-of-way. They're ready to go. All they need is one simple thing: a loan guarantee. Not money, just a simple loan guarantee so that they know that they can build the pipeline and that the ethanol industry can use it and get the fuel to the East Coast, where the majority of our population is right now, and where we have a dearth. We don't have enough ethanol in our major population centers. So again, we need to redouble our national commitment to expanding the use of renewable energy and weaning ourselves from imported oil. But we're not going to do it with these two amendments today. You know, the ethanol industry says they just want the marketplace to be able to accept it and let them stand there on their own 2 feet. They can do that. That's more important than the tax subsidies. I might also add, I remember debating this issue with the then senator from Texas, Senator Graham. We had a lot of debates on the Senate floor and back in the 80s or 90s, I guess, on this issue. And I pointed out at that time that the ethanol industry, if you talk about the tax credits and support from the government that the ethanol industry has gotten, pales in comparison to the dozens of years of tax write-offs and benefits we've given the oil companies in America, going clear back to about 1920. You think about all of the tax benefits we've given the oil companies in America: to drill, to produce, to ship, to pipe, to refine, to market. Add it all up. Add it all up, and ethanol is just a small part of that. But the oil companies have never given up. On their assault on ethanol and on biofuels. The Feinstein-Coburn Amendment is precipitous. Again, as I said, I'm more than willing, and hopefully before the end of the year. Now, the ethanol tax credits are going to expire at the end of this year. Hopefully before the end of the year, we will reach some agreement, work out something where we have more access to the marketplace. And then we can do away with the tax credits. But we should not take an action that would slash the value of the ethanol industry's primary product by nearly 20% overnight. Think about it this way. We have a 1-year extension of the ethanol tax credits. It goes to the end of this year. We did that. The Congress did that. We said that to the industry. Investors have come in. Modifications to plants have been built. Plants have been built. And yet in the middle of the year, we're going to say, no, we're going to take it away. To all my friends over there that keep talking about the private sector and how we need the private sector, we don't need the government. You're going to pull the rug out from underneath the private sector on a guarantee that we gave them earlier this year. No industry could survive a shock like that. No industry could survive that. And it's wrong. It's just wrong to do that at this point in time. Well, Madam President, we all know one thing. These votes this afternoon, okay, people can come down here and vote against ethanol, vote against the tax credits for the ethanol industry, vote to cut off marketplace access to the ethanol, But nothing's going to happen. The House will blue slip it, and then we'll be on to doing what really needs to be done in a logical way, and that is to reduce the tax credits for ethanol, which I'm all in favor of doing, if in fact we then can promote market access. Senator Lugar and I in the past had worked on a bill together. I reintroduced it basically this year that would do three things. It would mandate a certain proportion of blender pumps be installed at the large gasoline stations, those that are owned by the major oil companies. It would provide tax credits to the small mom-and-pop stations that would put in a blender pump in their station, the independents. And third, it would mandate a gradual increase over the next few years of the number of cars produced in America, sold in America, that are flexible fuel. Now, if we do all those things, ethanol will stand on its own 2 feet. I want to just say one last thing before I yield the floor to the senator from Ohio, I guess, and that is this. Right now, people have made much of the fact that there's $5 billion of tax credits this year going to the ethanol industry. I understand that. However, because of the lower price of ethanol, because we're blending 10% ethanol into gasoline, all of the people in America today are paying less for their gasoline than they otherwise would if we didn't have ethanol. So if you take that into account, the fact that the consumers of America, when they fill up their gas tank, are paying less than they would if they didn't have ethanol, that more than offsets the $5 billion that we have put into the tax credits for ethanol support. So yes, we have supported the ethanol industry with $5 billion. I dare say we've gotten back probably twice as much as that in savings at the gas pump for the consumers of America. Now, perhaps that's what the oil companies are mad about. Maybe they'd like to have that money for themselves. I suppose that's probably true. I understand that. But I think our obligation to the consumers of America and to the private sector who is operating on a guarantee that we gave them, that we would have these tax credits at least till the end of this year. And I think on an implicit guarantee that we gave that we would make sure that there would be a marketplace that would be open and accessible for biofuels. So that's what we need to do is to reduce the tax credits, but open up the marketplace for ethanol in blender pumps and in flexible fuel cars. But that's not before us today. That's not what's before us today. But we will continue to work together, again, as I said, towards the end of this year to make a reasonable, smooth transition from the tax credits to access to the marketplace. And I will take the floor again and again the remainder of this year and on. I'm not doing it today, but I will show the amount of tax credits, not credits, the amount of tax benefits the oil companies have gotten over the last 80 years. Add that up and compare it to what the ethanol industry has gotten over the last about 30 years. And you will see that the oil companies have gotten a lot more than what ethanol has ever received from the government. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.